welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share scary encounters with black-eyed children. These stories include two that were emailed to me by a subscriber who had a bizarre encounter when he was 12 or 13 years old, and another one that happened recently at his home and is still ongoing. The other stories include a young lady who had these entities show up at her front door one night, and a man who saw something terrifying while at work. I'd also like to thank Scott for emailing in his stories and allowing me to share them with you. Also, from what I gathered, he seems to be having some trouble with these things, and I'd very much like to help him out if we can. Alright, let's get into today's stories. I'd like to again thank Scott for sharing his stories. He details a strange and bizarre experience he had as a child. His first email reads as follows. I think I was 12 or 13 at the time. I was riding with my mom down the highway. Suddenly we started to have car trouble and then the car just stopped. She told me to walk to the nearest mile marker and return to tell her what it was. This would have been in the late 90s or early 2000s period before Google Maps was on every phone. My mom had a basic cell phone, but that was it. It was broad daylight in the summer and a simple enough task. So I get out of the car and walk to the marker. I'm just making a note of it when a car pulls up. It's a minivan with tinted windows. The passenger window rolls down and a normal looking man and woman are in the front seat. The man looks at me and says, "Car trouble?" I nodded and pointed back at the car. My mom is in the driver's seat with her head down. "Hop in," said the man. "I'll give you a ride and do what I can to help." I didn't even think twice. I just nodded. I didn't have excellent self-preservation skills. The door to the van slid open. I climbed inside. It was only then that I saw the van was filled with children. They were only dressed modestly. This was normal in the area due to the religious makeup. Heck, I wore only black shoes for religious reasons well into my teens. What was unusual about these children was their eyes. They were dead black. The eye color didn't match their skin or hair colors. Their hair was a range of colors and didn't look related. But I think they were all fair-skinned. I sat down next to one of the boys. They were all silent. The adult started driving, and after a few minutes I saw they weren't turning around. I began to get scared. "Hey, my car is back the other way," I said. The adults exchanged a look. Then the boy next to me spoke up. "No." His voice was low but firm. Without a word, they turned around at the first chance and got me back to my mom. She was freaking out by the time I got back. As soon as I got out of the van, they sped off. I got a lecture about getting in the van in the first place, but I was so glad to be safe. I sent this to another YouTube channel, but he still needs to read it. The next part, however, I didn't send him. After this encounter, I changed. My mental health was never excellent, but it totally collapsed after this encounter. I felt depressed and got very sick. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I ended up with several stomach ulcers. I was out of school for nearly a year because I was so ill. I would get, quote, phantom fevers that would spike dangerously high and then disappear. Meanwhile, something else odd was happening when I was going through this. Children were becoming drawn to me. I'd go to a store and they would cling to me. When their parents would try to separate them, they'd cry and throw a fit. This never happened before my encounter. My health stayed bad for years, but I recovered in my early 20s. I have seen the children since then, but that is another long story. That is the end of his email. For my thoughts on this one, I will share what I told Scott when I wrote him back. I would absolutely say you encountered black-eyed children. This encounter is both scary and bizarre, especially the part where the boy said no and they turned around immediately. Also, while reading it, I kept thinking over and over, "Don't get in the van, please don't get in the van." I don't think I have to tell you that you're very lucky they turned around. I've heard stories where these beings seem to have some sort of control over people. One story in particular comes to mind where someone was in a grocery store and they saw a black-eyed girl seemingly controlling an older woman. It was very strange to say the least. As for your health, I've heard stories and it seems to be the most widely accepted theory where people who interact with these beings, and definitely those who let them in, start having health problems right away. Many of them end up dying as a result. That's the first thought I had as I read about your health troubles, that these beings has something to do with it. I'm glad you eventually got over it and you're doing well now. What do you think about this one? And why do you think they abruptly turned around and dropped Scott back off? The next story also comes from Scott, who shared another encounter with black-eyed children that is ongoing to this day. I will mention that he had a car accident before sending me this story that he believes may be related. His email reads as follows. Well, I live on a rather large farm, 60 plus acres in the middle of nowhere. I enjoy the peace and quiet of life away from others. I have a husband and a teenage son, but we mostly keep to ourselves. One morning, I was looking out a side window of my house into a field looking for deer. I want to say this was around 8 in the morning. That window looks out into a field and towards the woods. The field is fenced in, but it doesn't stop the deer. You usually only see deer there early in the morning, but sometimes they just pop up at all hours of the day if it's quiet enough. As I watch the tree line hoping to see a deer, a turkey, or the odd bobcat, I see something else. There is a small figure on the edge of the tree line. Comparing it to the fence post, this person seems to be around 3 feet tall, so a child. I find this very odd. It's 8 in the morning on a weekday. Why isn't this child at school? I live in a small rural community, and while I avoid people, knowing your neighbors well, it comes with the territory whether you like it or not. I homeschool my son, and I know the other parents who do. There aren't many around here, and I've never seen these kids before. I watch this strange child walk the fence line as if waiting for something. He keeps glancing back at the woods. I can't see his face. He's wearing a heavy dark hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head. Finally, a second figure emerges from the woods, dressed and looking about the same. They stand next to each other, heads down. Then they lift their heads and look toward my house, towards me. I still can't see their faces, but I feel something is wrong. They turn and head back into the woods. Even if these were kids, their route made no sense. There's just woods there, deep woods, and then an access road and more woods. If they were skipping school, they'd still have no reason to be there and head deep into those trees. I told my husband, and he said if they were supernatural, they were likely fairy children and wouldn't do any harm. He encouraged me to leave food and other offerings at the fence line. My bad luck started after these children showed up again. Little things started happening. I noticed I was having health issues again. I was reluctant to offer them anything and decided to trust him. I usually trust my husband's view and opinion on these things. I feel like he knows more about the supernatural than he should. He worked at a top secret military base many years ago. I won't say which for safety and legal reasons. He can't say what he did or anything like that, but I can guess for his education and job history it was some form of engineering. He avoids talking about it or UFOs in general, but he is interested in other supernatural topics and seems to know a lot about the things he is willing to discuss. I started leaving food at the fence line every few days, sometimes good fresh meat, other times scraps. As long as I did, things were okay, but if I forgot, bad things would happen, including a brutal sinus infection. My face swelled up overnight. Even my doctor couldn't figure out how it had gotten so bad so quickly. I hadn't left food out a few days before the car accident, so I wonder if there was a connection. That is the end of the email. The accident he mentions was a car wreck in which he totaled his car. He is recovering and doing well. As far as the story, that must have been terrifying to see 2 hooded individuals emerge from the woods and stare at your house. Much less to know that they had to be children based on their size and for there to be nothing around and no reason for them to be there. Then adding in the supernatural aspect makes it even creepier. For him to know that these kids were looking at him and for him to feel like something was wrong, That's common in a lot of stories, including how they were dressed. No disrespect meant to Scott, but I don't think gifting with these beings is the right course of action. It's almost like submitting to them and giving them power over you. I fully believe that these things are demonic in nature, but definitely pure evil. Evil entities need permission to come into our lives. That's why black-eyed children have to be invited or allowed to enter someone's home or car. It's very important to not give them permission to enter if you should find yourself in that situation. I mentioned at the end of the first story how bad things happen when these beings are allowed to enter someone's life. This seems to be the case here as well. I told Scott about some options, including a personal story of mine dealing with an evil entity in my home. When I started this channel, it was to entertain and inform, but I also want to try to help people when I can. This is one of those situations. That said, I'd really like to hear what advice you might have for Scott. I hate to see someone stuck in a situation like what he is going through, and if there is any way I or someone else can help, I would really like to do so. You can leave your thoughts and suggestions in the comments or email them to me and I'll pass them along to him. What do you think about this story? Do you think there is any correlation between him missing putting food out and the bad things that happened to him? And what about the wreck? Also, do you think the encounter he had when he was a child has anything to do with these beings showing up at his home? The next story comes from a poster who had a strange experience while home alone back in 2016. Her parents were at work and her siblings were at their father's house. She does not say where her story takes place. As she sat watching TV, a knock on the door caught her attention. When she went to answer it, she found a little girl wearing sunglasses standing there. A sense of unease immediately washed over her as if something malicious was about to transpire. She asked the girl who she was, to which she replied by saying she wanted to come inside. The OP asked her why, and she answered saying that she needed to come inside. To this, she told the girl that she wasn't comfortable with her coming in due to her parents not being home and that she could go ask a neighbor. This is when the girl took off her sunglasses and revealed pitch black eyes. She then told the OP that she needed to come inside. Without thinking, the OP started to open the door, but then a sudden realization struck her, causing her to swiftly slam it. She then went to every door and window in the home, ensuring they were securely locked. Extremely freaked out by the events that happened, she was unable to sleep that night. She had not told a soul what happened until she posted her story online. I'm glad the OP caught herself before opening the door and allowing these entities to enter her home and by extension her life. I mentioned in the last story that these beings need permission to enter our homes, cars, and/or lives. It's why they can't just come in. There's no telling what would have happened if the girl had been allowed to enter her home. As I mentioned before, I've heard many stories where people immediately begin to experience health problems that sometimes turn fatal. As I also mentioned before, all of this makes me think and believe that these beings are evil and demonic in nature. What do you think about this one? What would you do if one of these things showed up at your door and wanted to come inside? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had a bizarre encounter while at work. It happened 10 years before they took to the online community to share their story while they were a sales associate working in the grocery section at Walmart. As he went about his job, putting returned items back on the shelf, he suddenly felt a pair of eyes fixed on him. He instinctively turned and found a blonde Caucasian lady in her late 50s by his estimate. He was standing in the middle of the aisle and she was positioned at the far end. She appeared to be perfectly ordinary at first glance, dressed in regular clothes and pushing an empty shopping cart. However, when he caught sight of her face, he noticed that her eyes were pitch black. A wave of dread washed over him he describes as the most intense he has ever felt. His heart sank and he couldn't move fast enough leaving that aisle. He never again crossed paths with a woman, and this was the only thing he had ever experienced like that in his life. He ends by saying that the feeling he had is something he cannot explain. The woman exuded an intense wickedness unlike anything he's ever felt before. He then welcomes others to share their similar experiences before saying he knows it wasn't someone with novelty contact lenses. He is aware of what they look like, and what he saw that day was not that. This isn't the first story I've heard of someone encountering an adult with pitch black eyes, and it isn't the first encounter I've heard in a grocery store. I know technically this was a Walmart, but it was in the grocery section of the store. The other story is the one I mentioned after the first story of this episode, involving a little girl with black eyes seemingly leading around an elderly lady, filling her cart with food and snacks fitting for a child as the girl danced around merrily. But going back to this story, I believe I also would have had the same reaction if I saw a black-eyed person staring at me from the far end of the grocery aisle. He did the right thing by getting out of there. I'm just glad he hasn't seen the strange woman since, and there hasn't been any further incidents involving him. I would, however, like to know if any of his co-workers have ever seen this woman or anyone else with black eyes in that Walmart. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you saw someone with black eyes staring at you in public? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.